So I'm here with former professor at Salem State University and poet Rod Kessler, and he's a resident of Salem, Massachusetts, which is the subject of the book that he edited and wrote an introduction to. What I'm always waiting for about the street poet, reclusive poet Melvin Miller, who passed away a while back.
It's Malcolm.
Malcolm
Malcolm
Miller.
Miller.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Malcolm Miller. And he's going to talk a bit about this. I was going to ask him, Malcolm was, well, I mean, a friend of mine talked to Don Scher, who was once the curator of the Woodbury Poetry Room at Harvard. And he said, well, we take accept two kinds of books, in the archive, one from very accomplished poets and others from characters, quote unquote. Now, let me ask you, if would you have pursued this as passionately, the poetry of Malcolm Miller, as passionately, if he wasn't a character? I mean, it would just be another good poet. What do you think?
Well, I think I can answer that pretty easily, that I certainly would have, because I knew the poems before I knew the man. And let me tell you that story because it bears on your question. As you mentioned, I taught at Salem State, first college, then university, for a long time, 31 years before I retired. I'll have to make one slight correction that I'm primarily a fiction writer, although I have published poetry and I've taught those genres. I received in my English department mailbox from time to time a cheap little self-published volume of poetry with a note in it from an unknown stranger named Malcolm Miller. The note would generally read something like, if you like these poems, please send $5. And there was an address in Salem, which meant nothing to me. And
well, right there, it's to send $5. So that's a bit of a character.
I assumed he was just, some local guy who wanted to be a poet, probably wasn't very good. And I never looked at these poems, but I would send the $5 because I felt sorry. I thought, well, if this is how this guy is going to make it through the world, fine. I could afford it. And but I didn't throw these books away. I put them on a shelf. And why
didn't you throw them away?
I don't throw anything away.
Okay.
And I had to learn to do that. I'm from that. Well, you probably too are from that age cohort where the last thing you feel comfortable about is throwing away a photograph, for example, because when we were kids they were rare. Right. And I'm terrible. I still have the earliest drafts of my stories that well, I can't imagine anybody would have any interest in them. But I guess I had a foolish archivist sense in me that one should hang on to stuff. And I had plenty of room. I had a capacious office at Salem State. I had room for it. So I would stack these things on a shelf. They were easy to spot because they had the same, dull gray covers. But for whatever reason, at one point, I started to read them. And I was just shocked because I thought he was terrific. And at that point, I tried to track him down and ask people about him. And since I always had his address, and it turned out to be, less than half a mile from campus, public housing, he and I developed a kind of correspondence. Of course, I was paying him $5 all the time. I'm sure he thought well of me. But he wouldn't agree to meet for coffee. He wouldn't agree to come and talk to my poetry students. He wouldn't agree to giving a reading at Salem State. But he did agree to let me try to publish some of his poems in the campus literary magazine, Soundings East, which in those days I was the faculty advisor to. And, I couldn't just say, publish this, I had to run it by the student editorial board. But they loved his writing too, and they were the ones who made that first selection. And Miller became the featured poet of the 2013 volume. And the way I actually met this guy was I carried a dozen copies to his public housing apartment in Salem and rang his buzzer. And that was how I first laid eyes on him and got to have a much stronger sense of what an eccentric he was. I mean, to give you some sample of who this man was, and the person who answered the buzzer, and it took him a long time to get there, looked like he was almost dying. He was so frail. He was tall, bald, imposing, but weak. And he said to me, go up to the top of the staircase here and go into my place and I'll meet you there. And then he sat down on the stairs to catch his breath. Well, he made it up there. And he lived as a pauper. He didn't have furniture. He slept on the bare floor in a really ragged sleeping bag. His clothes were not in a dresser, but in like grocery store plastic bags suspended from the doorknobs of the doors in his place. He had just one chair and he took it. Okay, so that's like one impression of this guy. But before our interview was over, he wanted to show me something, and he went into his kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out this big fat envelope, and it was stuffed with $100 bills. This guy had something, I don't know how many thousands of dollars in his hand. And he swore me to secrecy because if the public housing authority knew he had this money, he couldn't live in public housing. But why was he choosing to live the way he did when at any moment he could have had a much richer life? His poetry answers that question. He was pretty consistent on a theme that you had to live close to, how would he describe it? If you're quiet enough and connected enough and close enough to the world, you might begin to hear a kind of spiritual singing and get connected with it. But materialism would get in your way. He had family that despised him because he would show up at dinner time and want to be fed, and yet he was totally contemptuous of them because they were successful. They were lawyers.
I heard he had in your introduction, you wrote he had $36,000 in cash.
No, it wasn't all in cash, as it turned out. It turned out there had been a bank account, which he didn't tell me about, but when he had to go through probate, yeah, it was something like that. I think it was $24,000 in all. And that money mostly got reabsorbed by the state, although his funeral expenses were paid for, which is to say what it costs to keep a body cold until things get settled and he could be cremated.
Yeah.
But, so you get the sense of this guy. He almost was like, Thoreau in a way of his, I guess, desire to be spiritually connected to the world. And he thought the way to do that was through a kind of simple, direct life.
But, in fact, the title of the book is What I'm Always Waiting For. So
Yeah.
What is he waiting for? This sort of spiritual communion, or what do you think?
I think that's part of it, but there were other things too, because like the book is divided into sections, and the sections, I think, reflect different themes of his poems. Mind you, this guy was very prolific. He had published two, let's call them legitimate books of poems in Montreal in the very early 1970s through a press called Tundra Press. His first book won an award, not so much for the poetry as for its just physical beauty and artwork as a book. It was a big coffee table book. It cost $30 in 1970, I think. He was appalled by that. The last thing he wanted was to be a coffee table poet that only wealthy people could buy. And he turned his back on that. And he went on to publish 59 books, that is to say, self-publish, as cheaply as he could. But when you add all these poems up, there was something like 3,500 poems. I got them all because when he died unattended on the floor of his public housing apartment, it turned out that he had listed me as his emergency contact. Surprise to me. And the city called me up and said, look, we got to clear this guy's stuff out. Come and get it, or we're throwing it away. And I was able to salvage a lot of his manuscripts. And he'd already given me quite a few, because I think he had figured out that I was going to be the guy to do what I'm doing.
It's interesting. I think a lot of us poets have someone I had one very similar one, Ed Gehling, who died at 96, and he would send me books and self-publish and things like that. And he actually, before he died, he was in the New Yorker. But, unfortunately, I never, met him. I just knew him through email correspondence and phone calls. But this is great that you actually met this man and got a real sense of him.
Of course, only in his last year as an
Yeah.
84-year-old who's kind of weak. And yet, I have gotten to know him pretty well through his poems, but also through the people in his life who are still around. And he went through different stages. And there are people who hated him or felt that he was intimidating and condescending. And, some people who are, let's say, how should we call it, would be spiritually pure can get on other people's nerves. But and he was
and that was very evident in the documentary that Kevin Carey and you were involved in. Yeah, when they talked about that.
Can I read one of his poems that sort of expresses that spiritual side of his?
Mm-hmm.
It's in the book. It's called Conquistador. It's also a poem that's read in the documentary.
You're going to read it? Yeah, go ahead.
Conquistador. To set out of a morning and take the first fresh light on your sleep-dimmed skin, and reckon with the sea banging out its call for volunteers to taste the cold tidal salt, to lure a careful cat successfully, to play and feel the rich fur and be hypnotized by its eyes, to drown in the general drift of things, no more important than a tree or a brick in a wall, to go from way to way like a current of air or a campfire story told over and over, to gaze at the sky changing and to know in 10,000 years my kind will be gazing, and to come home baffled by the wonder of things, to sit in your room glowing like a star.
Nice. Now, on one hand, Miller was a recluse, and I know he had an affair with a much younger woman and waitress and things like that. But I mean, he was a recluse, and he wanted to be a pure poet, I think. But actually, did seek attention. I mean, he sought you out, even though he wouldn't go to lectures and things like that. He obviously wanted an audience for his work. Yes. I mean, there was that yin yang going, right?
Very much so. In fact, he assiduously sent all of his little self-published books, not only to the Salem State Library, which was the closest library to where he lived, but to the City of Salem Public Library, to the Phillips Library, which is now part of the Peabody Essex Museum, and certainly to his alma mater, the McGill Library. McGill, in its rare books and special collections room, has a whole box full of Malcolm Miller papers and paraphernalia and novel manuscripts and correspondence. Well, one piece of correspondence that might interest you and your audience is he was friends with the Gloucester poet Vincent Farini, and he managed to get copies not of Vincent Farini's letters, but the letters he himself wrote to Vincent Farini, and these are now all in the McGill Library. So I think he had a very sharp eye out for his immortality, but I don't think he cared very much about the money. Yes and no. I mean, to a certain extent, he needed it to survive. There are letters in the McGill collection of his almost badgering the director of the special collections to send him some payment for these, items he was sending. Some of it had to do with his friendship and correspondence with other Canadian writers. Miller went to McGill in the very, I guess he graduated in 1950. He was friends with this group of young Canadian English-speaking poets and, knew them at a specific time. But in any case, he would try to get $100 or $150 for some of these things. And another interesting detail was he was a McGill pal of Leonard Cohen. And when he went to Montreal after he graduated, he'd often stay on Leonard Cohen's couch. And Leonard Cohen would evidently send Malcolm a check for $100 every year during the Jewish high holidays. And one year when the check didn't arrive, he wrote to the McGill, director of rare books and special collections, asking him, well, listen, if you run into Leonard Cohen, would you remind him that the high holidays have come? Could he send the money? And the guy wrote back, look, there's not much chance I'm going to run into Leonard Cohen. But so
But
there was.
Cohen, yeah, I remember interviewing some English professor from Bentley, and he was telling me that he thought Cohen was probably the best poet ever to come out of Canada. What would you say about that?
Well, I don't know about that. If I could read it over my bookshelves for a second.
I mean, he stopped writing poetry after a while and went into singing, of course, but.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if your viewers can see me going from my bookshelf, but a Canadian poet that I would especially prize is Irving Layton, and he was like a one age cohort ahead of Leonard Cohen and Malcolm Miller, but very much an influence, I would say, and how should I say, really broke through to the more contemporary writing that we're used to. And this is his collected works published in Canada. I bought it in the McGill bookstore the day I went looking at Malcolm Miller's stuff. So I was pretty impressed with that. Miller used to say that the difference between him and Leonard Cohen was that Leonard Cohen had music as well, and that if Malcolm Miller, could also do the music side, he would have been as successful.
Right. Do you think that Cohen's writing influenced Malcolm's at all?
No, I don't think so. I think that they were, already diverging, let's say, from the same source. Well, that's not even true. No. And there's one poem of Malcolm's in all these 3,500s that's explicitly about Leonard Cohen, and he kind of takes Leonard Cohen for task for seemingly, how shall I say, diving into the world of Eastern spiritualism in a way that might have seemed self-serving. So it was a farewell poem, but it was not a poem.
Did he still get the checks from Cohen after that?
It was long after that. And the end of the story, of course, is that when Kevin Carey was making the film, he tried very hard to get in touch with Leonard Cohen to get some kind of connection for the film. And Leonard Cohen wrote him an email saying he was very fond of Malcolm, but too sick to do anything more than that. But
yeah. Now, I'm sorry. What was his relationship? I mean, how did he view the city of Salem? I mean, was it like William Carlos Williams of Paterson, New Jersey? And I mean, what was his relationship?
Well, first of all, it was a very deep one, since he grew up here. He didn't live here all of his life, but he's got plenty of poems about it. Some of them are respectful, reverential, knowing. Others of them are critical in a way. I mean, he has some very funny poems about tourists who come to Salem looking for things that don't exist and having to satisfy themselves with T-shirts and multi-flavored ice cream cones. He laughed at politicians, but he liked the natural side of Salem. He liked the water. Even his public housing apartment was right up on the water. He has a poem that maybe gives a sense of that. If I could read another one.
Yeah, sure.
Take me just a second to find it. He lived in a housing area called Pioneer Terrace, and his mother lived there before him. In fact, there was a time when she was living in senior housing and he crashed on her couch. And then when she got old, she went to a rehabilitation hospital in the next town over in Swampscott. And Malcolm crashed there too, if you can believe it.
Mm-hmm.
He had been homeless, but he found his ways to not be. And in this,
I mean, if he did he ever have a vocation? I mean, he was a poet, but I mean, did he ever have any work experience or none?
Yes, he had work experience when he was a young man. He actually worked in the Salem area at a plastics factory, on a machine that extruded plastic. And this was something that propped up in one of his novel manuscripts where he uses that in a scene. He worked for a while on a project in the Eastern Railroad where they were rebuilding the ties on the railroad. And he was a very hard worker. People who knew him from that time, talked about this guy had immense strength and he could handle immense kind of privations. Malcolm in some of his poems, he was a great walker. He would walk from Salem to Gloucester, and that's a long way, and he could take it. But this poem I was going to read, it's called "My Mother Has to Go to the Rehab Hospital," but in it he gives a little description of the world around that building, and part of what interests me is that I know that's where he ended up and spent a lot of time too in that very same cluster of public housing. So it's "My mother has to go to the rehab hospital. I come to her old place to pick up a few things, mail and the like. And out the window, see in the park, under the low-hanging shade trees, a woman sitting in a chair right where mother used to sit. From this angle and distance, it almost is mother, but she will never sit under the summer trees again. She is lying in the red brick rehabilitation hospital like a doll in its crib. She will never sit under the summer trees again, and the only hope now is she doesn't know it." So that I walk by that public housing complex fairly regularly now that we're in the coronavirus and I walk places. And it's a beautiful park-like area right by the water. And Malcolm wrote a poem that I submitted on his behalf that won, if you can believe this, an international poetry competition sponsored by the International Lawrence Durrell Society. And every year they have a competition, and it's open to anybody in the English-speaking world. And the theme of this poem was harbors, whether literal or symbolic. And I submitted a poem of his about being a boy and going down to the water in Salem Harbor and just being in touch with the beauty of the world. And as I say, when I walk through his neighborhood and there's the water, there are these trees, it does give me a sense of that side of him.
And just, when he was at McGill, I know he knew Leonard Cohen, as we discussed. Were there any professors or writers who were very influential in this?
Yes, there was. Harold Files was the name of his professor. And I think that Harold was a Harvard man in his day and taught at McGill and was the kind of professor who in the campus quad would talk to engineering students and try to persuade them to take literature courses. And I don't think they had creative writing when Malcolm was at McGill, but he could write work for Harold Files. And he's written some poems about Harold Files, but the ironic or sad thing is that Harold Files killed himself. And he killed himself by throwing himself into a river in Vermont off a bridge. And the horrible thing about it was that he didn't succeed the first time. He went back up and did it again. And so that's disturbing. But he did have that connection. And those poems are not in this book, but with any luck, there will be subsequent books and maybe we'll see that one.
So why don't you read a few more from the book? Now show us the cover. Very nice cover. And where can it be bought? I imagine Amazon. Where else?
I would recommend that people
don't do your Amazon, but
Copper Dog Books in Beverly, Massachusetts. That's I would say the nearest independent bookstore.
And they're publishing books too, or?
No, they will order it for you. They will get it for you.
Okay.
Go to Amazon when you can support a local bookstore. But that's probably the case anywhere. Any bookseller can get this.
Oh yeah.
But I'm trying to promote the local indie. Anyway, I would love to read a few more.
Okay, a couple more.
This one's called Letter to an Old Girlfriend. I have $1,000 in the bank and an almost worthy hotel room paid for a week. I am sitting here listening to Bach on a little radio, smoking a cigar and drinking a good European lager. The police or mafia are not after me, though there was a chance they could have been. Outside is a small green park, sun is in the trees and birds, and you said I'd be a failure. I want to show you something. Sorry, I happen to have near at hand this little radio. This was left in his apartment. This is one of the
transistor, yeah,
that I picked up, and
Yeah.
now I have. It still runs perfectly well. He used to listen to opera every Sunday, apparently, when opera was broadcast, and he also was not above listening to the Red Sox. Small
Okay.
story about this. One time he wrote me a letter saying, could you please come and help me? Which is how we communicated. And I went, and it turned out that he needed to replace his previous small radio. And he asked me if I would go over to a Radio Shack and buy him one. And I said, well, why don't I take you? And sure enough, you know, he got down the stairs and I drove him over and I put him right in front of the store. But, you know, I said to him, look, why get a cheap little thing like this? You could get a beautiful radio with a wonderful sound system and you'd be able to enjoy your operas even more. He wouldn't hear of it. He only wanted the simplest, smallest one. And so, you know, I kind of cherish that about him.
Mhm.
You have room for more? Another
Yeah,
poem?
one more. Yeah.
Okay, well, this is one, you know, you mentioned that he had a girlfriend. He actually had a wife, and he married when he was in Montreal to a woman named Sandra Zacharin, and she died young. She had diabetes, and it was terrible. But this is a poem that remembers her.
And Miller seemed to suffer from mental illness as well, right? He had paranoid delusions.
Yes, towards the end, he certainly did. I mean, he told me he was hearing voices and he thought it could be the government, but he was able to snap out of it. I mean, he was not like a loony all the time, but clearly something was going on in his head. And when he was a bit younger, perhaps in his 40s or 50s, he had a little stint at Danvers State
Mental hospital.
Yeah. Anyway, this one's called Montreal, Rue Victoria, near McGill. When we were just beginning, remember, you said to get a strong board to put under the mattress. The room was a little bigger than the bed. Over the everyday table I composed so-so poems on, a naked bulb testified to the poverty and marvel of human light. More than anything else, but perhaps some divinity, your hips made me eventually a poet. You've been lying up there 6 feet deep in a section of your native town almost 30 years. I'm in love again. I'm in love again, and something drew me to this street today. A huge aluminum-looking office building sits like a big tin can where once that room defined itself against the world as glorious. They have not improved on that address, oh, still loved one. Oh, I love that thought of him standing outside.
Are you going to be reading from your book anywhere? I mean, virtually or whatever?
I think that some invitations are starting to come in, and I'm waiting to get things firmed up. I would love to do that. Of course, I'm not Malcolm Miller, and I have no idea how he would read his poems. I've never heard him read his poems.
You think he'd be glad about this attention you're bringing his way?
Well, it's not a great question. Well, considering that he gave me so many of his works before he died, which gave me the rest of them, and gave me express written permission to try to seek the publication of his work, although I had to cajole that out of him because he had been saying no, and he'd been saying no to other people. Yes, I think that maybe he thought that I would be the one who would somehow manage to get his work out there, or keep his work out there, or
Mhm.
save him from obscurity. And of course, it's very, very sad to think about all these other poets and artists who don't have someone advocating for them.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Poet to Poet, Writer to Writer.